Hey guys, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Good morning. My name is Sarah Coleman. I am the Business Development and Marketing Manager for AVAIL Technology Solutions. Super excited to have you here today while we present our webinar on cybersecurity and ransomware insurance tips. James T. Morrison will be running most of the webinar today, but first I'd like to introduce you to our President and CTO, Jason Cadwallader.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. Jason Cadwalder, President of AVAIL. Really excited to have you guys join today's webinar on a topic that I think is of interest to many of us in the technology space when it comes to cybersecurity, ransomware. We get a lot of our customers, our clients coming to us asking us to help them fill out their cyber insurance forms and requirements, making sure that they have all the technologies in place to be able to get cyber insurance. So we know it's getting increasingly more challenging in that space, and that's really what AVAIL is for. We're here to help our customers, our clients, work through those issues, make sure they have the right technologies, help them get those technologies implemented. So at AVAIL, we work with our clients to help them procure technology. We've been doing it for over 30 years, 800 plus clients across the United States. And we work in a number of different technology stacks like cybersecurity, but also work in collaboration, cloud services, internet connectivity, any type of networking technology. We're the partner that you should be reaching out to, and we can help you find the right solutions, get those solutions implemented and managed, and help with the ongoing resources to ensure that they're delivering for you. So we're a partner. Just if you have any questions after this presentation, reach out through availnow.com or any of the other social media platforms that we're on, and we can help you find the right technology. We have a huge portfolio of different market-leading providers across all these different technology stacks, and we'll work with you. We've got a proven process to help you evaluate those technologies and make the right decisions to get those technologies implemented and supporting your business initiatives. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to James, and hope you guys get something useful out of this presentation. And thank you very much for your time this morning.
All right. Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you very much, AVAIL. My name is James Morrison. I am a retired FBI computer scientist. But currently I work as a cybersecurity evangelist and advisor for a company called Intelisys, which is helps companies like AVAIL find security or any technology solution across this entire stack. At the same time, I teach cybersecurity here. I'm down here in Houston, Texas. And I've been in the IT field about 35 years. 1988, I walked into an Air Force recruiter office, and they said, what do you want to do? And I said, you tell me. And they said, here computers. And I was lucky enough to get sort of started into a career that probably wasn't what I was intending at that time, but it's been a good career. What I want to talk about to start with is this idea where we are and where we sit right now in cybersecurity in particular. 10 years ago, when I started working cybercrime in 2012, it was all nation state. It was Russia, China, Iran, a little bit of North Korea, and it was all at a high level. Most of the Defense Department contractors, nation states, kind of messing with each other. But it started to change in 2013, 2014, and 2015. And we started to see a rise of what we now consider to be these cyber criminal groups out of countries from Russia, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and across the entire world. And so cybersecurity is probably one of those areas that we didn't put a lot of investment in, 10 years ago, but because of this criminal element, we have to start having different conversations around cybersecurity. So I'm a former CISO as well. I was a CISO for an MSSP for a little while before I joined Intelisys. And so I've sat in that side of the chair and watched as technology solutions have been sort of thrown over the fence at me. And I realized that it's a very complex landscape. So what I want to talk about today is we're going to talk about the ransomware landscape, the threat landscape, but then also sort of talk around the idea of how do we navigate this crazy tech world that we live in. Now, the problem with cyber defense is that it has to be a constant, ongoing conversation. What I've run into when I go out and I meet with customers is a lot of times they've sort of let some of their cybersecurity defenses lapse over time. They either, they bought a firewall 4 years ago, they've bought the annual renewal, but they really haven't done anything else to expand their cybersecurity posture. And that's what we need to get ahead of. Cybersecurity is going to be a constant battle. It's going to be something that we continue to fund, and something that we continue to look at what is our risk, and in that risk, how do we satisfy the need that risk might encapsulate. Last week, a couple weeks ago, I was talking at a healthcare forum, and healthcare is one of those areas that's being targeted because of the idea that their defenses are very weak, according to many criminals out there. So if there's a perception of weakness, or there's a perception of a lack of depth in cybersecurity, you will find yourself targeted. It might be a random attack, or it might be, we just saw with this new Move IT breach, it might be driven around someone who feeds into your ecosystem. So one of the things that we've had a lot of conversations around is what we call supply chain management. Who is in your supply chain? What suppliers, what vendors have access into your environment, and how do I ensure that those vendors aren't actually adding an unnecessary amount of risk? So this is the evolving world that we live in, and it's going to continue to be more complex as the criminals look for more and more ways to create revenue around this. So 2023, when I started the conversation last year, vulnerabilities are going to increase or reduce in quantity while increasing in severity. And unfortunately, the Move IT is absolutely right up this alley. Every cybersecurity product needs to have a level of vigilance by its vendor. Companies like Fortinet, Palo Alto, the big firewall vendors, are always looking at their product to make sure that their product doesn't have critical vulnerabilities. And if they find those critical vulnerabilities, they know they have to patch them. And so just recently, Fortinet put out a very broad patch for a cybersecurity vulnerability that was found. The problem is the security vendors typically get it, but some other software vendors aren't necessarily as vigilant around that. Every software provided as a service, whether it's SolarWinds, whether it's Move IT, or whatever the next breach will be targeted against, have to be very vigilant. And we as consumers of their product need to demand from those vendors that they are being vigilant and protecting me and protecting my environment. So those vulnerabilities will continue to be exploited by these criminals. Also, global events, geopolitical storms will cause a rise in cyber attacks. You'll see in a slide a little bit later how in 2022, the number of ransomware attacks actually fell. And in early 23, we thought that number was going to hold. But what happened in early 23? Russia launched a new counteroffensive against Ukraine, and in that, they started to raise the number of cyber attacks that they were launching against Western companies and Western government agencies. So global events will have an impact on how we view cybersecurity. Multi-factor authentication, we'll talk about that. I believe multi-factor authentication, if you're not considering it, that has to be something everybody deploys. Now, the problem with some of these two-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication products is they're not all created equal. And where the danger of multi-factor authentication comes in is how it's implemented and how we train our people to make sure that they aren't falling prey to new phishing attacks. We saw phishing recently where very large companies were exploited when a system administrator or a software developer gave up the two-factor authentication code to a phishing via text. So two-factor authentication is just one part of the puzzle that we have to look at. And we also have to look at this idea of how do we train people? And that's part of the people process technology. And then lastly, information stealing. Ransomware, about 70% of ransomware attacks involve what we call double extortion, where they will steal your data at the same time and then turn around and ask for money to prevent that data from being made public. We saw in 2022 also a rise in what we call a triple extortion, where they were actually taking that data and going to customers and telling them they needed to pay to prevent their data from being made public. One of the largest examples of this was a plastic surgeon in Beverly Hills who lost the data of all of their customers. Now you can imagine this included a number of movie stars and public figures who had publicly denied that they'd ever had, plastic surgery. And these criminals were trying to reach out to these individuals and get them to give them money to prevent that data from being made public. The data that we store in every instance is something that can be exploitable by a criminal and could actually cause a risk, or at least we could actually find ourselves sued under civil suits based upon the loss of this data. We see the same with school districts. We've had some very large school districts breached, like Minneapolis and Los Angeles. And so schools are finding themselves really struggling with how do we, deploy better cybersecurity products. So realize that the data that you're storing in your environment is a target for these criminals because they see it as being the possibility of turning it into something, something that they can turn it into money. Also, we're seeing this rise of the dark web, and it's been going on for a number of years. And in my time in the FBI, we had just started to go after some of these dark web marketplaces. The dark web, if you're not monitoring the dark web for critical information for your company, it's something you might want to consider, especially around executives or system administrators. Every year, and I'll talk a little bit about this later as well, Verizon comes out with something called the Data Breach Investigative Report. And in there, they say that the most likely way for a company to be exploited is through lost or stolen credentials. How do you know if you have lost or stolen credentials? That's why sometimes we have to monitor the dark web to make sure that you're being notified should one of those credentials be stolen. Because once those credentials are stolen and then sold, they will be used within 12 hours to attempt to access your corporate network. And if that's a system administrator, or if that's a C-level figure or some sort of executive, that can cause a lot of damage into an environment. So we have to realize that. We have to understand that the dark web is a place that, at the very least, we need to know what's going on out there and monitor it for any sort of accesses that might be affecting our corporate environment. So this is it. This was the 4 things that the Data Breach Investigative Report from Verizon said in 22, and the new 23 one just came out and said just about the same thing. Credentials and phishing are the 2 most likely ways for people to intrude into your environments. Now, vulnerabilities are also exploitable, and that there's actually an appreciable number, somewhere between 5 to 10% of breaches occur because of that. And lastly, around this traffic, around the idea of botnets. So recognizing the path to intrusion then starts to get us understanding what are we actually trying to do to prevent those intrusions. And we'll dive into that a little bit more. But at the same time, we recognize it's about people. At the end of the day, the most likely exploitable resource is your people. 82% of breaches last year were around people being phished and them not understanding what they were doing, and they actually clicked on a link or an attachment. They either lost or stolen credentials, or even worse, they used the same password for their corporate account that they used for personal accounts. Some statistics show that as many as 60% of people use the same passwords on business accounts that they use for personal accounts. So if they lose access to a personal email through some sort of data breach, is that password the same? What about weak passwords? There are ways now to scan our networks to know whether or not the passwords being entered in are weak and actually force a stronger password. We're also seeing a push towards longer passwords. The old 8-character password has gone by the wayside. And if you're still using 8-character passwords, I would encourage you to push those password numbers out to 12 or 16. The reason is computers are getting faster and faster. One of my jobs in the FBI was to build password crackers, and Password Cracker could do an 8-character password right now in about 8 hours. So just by extending that password to 12 characters, we turn that number into a 34,000-year experiment. So think about those things. These are more policy questions than they are really technology. I even seen this, though, on websites. Websites are often exploited. and I've created accounts on websites where they wouldn't let me enter a password in longer than 12 characters. That is a vulnerability. That is a risk factor. So we have to consider, those kind of things of how are we going to prevent, or really authenticate people logging into our corporate network. So that's the human error element. So social engineering, phishing. Social engineering remains a very large attack surface. Are you training your people on social engineering? Now, the good thing is most of us understand the need for social engineering training, and we use things like KnowBe4 or Proofpoint or even Mimecast to actually do some of this training. But what we don't necessarily do is we don't hold people accountable when they continue to fail. A person who continues to fail phishing testing is a risk factor to our business. So we have to actually make sure that we're evaluating who fails and then turning around and actually providing additional training to that person if necessary. Or I've even seen some companies that will deploy different technologies to people who they feel are higher risk. Now that high risk may be because they've failed pen testing, or maybe they work in a particular environment like HR or finance that is often targeted by criminal elements. But data leaks are increasingly being caused around this idea of social engineering. Even the FBI suffered through one of these, where a person was able to call into the help desk and convince the operator that they were a new employee and get a password reset on a particular account. So social engineering is a training that not just about phishing, not just around email training, but what about that phone call? These criminals are increasingly becoming pretty bold around actually calling into a help desk and pretending to be a customer and then asking for information or asking for resets. So it's important to make sure that we're training people around what we call pretexting. A couple of years ago, I actually had the pleasure of meeting Frank Abagnale. If you've seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, and in that movie, that's all he does is he creates a persona and then actually gets people to give up that information through that persona. He said that if he was working today, he'd be a billionaire because there's much more money involved around these social engineering attacks, and he would be able to convince people to give that information up. So are you testing pretexting? Are you actually running simulated attacks against people in environments like finance and HR or executives? It's important to make sure that those people aren't falling for those stories that don't fall within your policy. And then, every IT professional, this is 70%, I think that number might even be low. Everybody feels like their employees have failed these attacks. So how are we going to handle that failed attack? Because one of the things we're seeing is, and this remains a very large and somewhat underreported crime, is this idea of account takeover, or what we used to call business email compromise. My office in Houston actually had a half squad that all they worked on was business email compromise attacks. And in these attacks, they're going to come in and they're going to try to transfer money out of your account. So I tell the story, I was on a cruise actually in January here out of Galveston, and the lady next to me was having a conversation, and I was listening in because that's kind of what I do sometimes. And she said, "Are you serious? They're in my account again. They're in my system again." And I handed her my card, and we talked for a little while, and it turned out that 3 times over the last 6 months, people had gotten into her corporate environment and were actually sending fraudulent financial transactions into her finance advisor. Originally it was the chief financial officer, then it was an IT manager, and so they bounced around to different people and were sending in these fraudulent invoices, and the money was leaking out because the policy didn't require their finance people to verify anything under $5,000. So they were paying these invoices. She wouldn't tell me how much the financial loss was, and I understood that. But this is a monstrous problem. Do you know if somebody is inside your system sending in these kind of fraudulent, invoices? We actually had a school district here in Texas that received an invoice from a construction company that looked legitimate, and they paid the invoice, close to $1 million. Then the actual construction company came to them and asked for payment, and they realized that they had been fraudulently lost that money, over almost $1 million. So how do you verify that that an invoice is real, how do you verify that you're actually paying the right account? So making sure you have policies in place to validate those invoices is critically important. And then how far down that stack do you go? If you say that I'm only going to verify over 5,000, are you willing to accept financial losses in that number below 5,000? Because the criminal will start trying to figure out where your line is, and they'll try to stay under that to avoid detection. So this could come through a breach in a partner. This could come through a breach of your own email. You could be breached, or just somebody just had a convincing story about needing money. One of the problems we've seen is, and I've seen this a couple of cases where a company has received an invoice from another company. There's a lot of finger pointing that goes on in the post-incident breach, in the post-breach fallout, where each company will say that it wasn't us that got breached, it was you that got breached, and they try to prove fault. This issue comes up mainly because insurance companies want to know who was at breach, who was at fault. So it's very, very important to make sure that you have proper security features in place to validate that you're not the one that was being breached. I even saw this in a very, very large South Korean company, where a company local was trying to do business with them, and that South Korean company had suffered a breach. It had been publicized, and somebody inside had sent an invoice to the local company, and they paid the invoice. And it turns out that the invoice was never paid directly to that company. So there was a lot of question back and forth as to who was at fault, and it was about $450,000. So make sure you have those things in place. How are you going to validate against this account takeover? The other thing is this remote access software. And this is this idea of living off the land. What software products do you have inside your environment that once a intruder is able to gain access to your environment, could they then use to expand their foothold into your corporate environment? We see this a lot with things like remote desktop protocol. We've seen this with PowerShell. So PowerShell is a software package running within Windows. And this was some of the large breaches we saw in 2022, where people had hard-coded passwords into PowerShell scripts. And so that once the criminals were able to gain access to this library of PowerShell scripts, they were able to bypass some of the security features inside your environment. So it's important to understand from a risk standpoint what software products inside my environment could be exploited by a criminal who gained access. And how would you know? So one of the things we say is, who can anybody access the remote desktop protocol? Can anybody access PowerShell? So validating who has access to some of these products is critically important as we go forward. Now, one of the things I've seen is we've all seen this thing about technology, people, and process, and that's where cybersecurity sits. I think it's wrong. I actually think that if we continue to deploy technology without an outcome and a strategy over the top, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So one of the things I do when I'm talking to people around the United States is I ask that question first. Do you have a cybersecurity policy or strategy in place? Technology agnostic. Do you have incident response plans in place? Have you tested them? Do you have disaster recovery plans in place, and have you tested them? The issue I run into repeatedly is that people buy technology without mapping it to a particular outcome. If you are saying, I want to avoid ransomware, great outcome. That is a direct outcome. Then the technology should be something that maps to that outcome. So I would strongly encourage, before any technology purchases occur, make sure you have that outcome mapped out, because people are buying technology all the time, and sometimes they're not buying that technology really with a goal in mind. One of the reasons is that a lot of the tech companies I work with, it's about marketing and sales. And I am very critical of them when they do this, but they will actually go out there and they will, they're just going to try to make a sale. And if they can get you to sign on the dotted line, they've got a 1 year contract. They've done their job. Don't fall for sales and marketing. Don't fall for it. Be very cautious when you go out to trade shows. The people that work the trade show booths are very good at what they do. They are intending to get you into them and then convince you that the product that they're selling is the best thing since sliced bread. Now, don't get me wrong. Many of them are great products, but they may not be the product you need right now. So instead, I want us to make a measured approach. Think about what we need. Look at the outcome. Hey, they may be where you end up, but let's look at options. Don't fall for marketing. Don't fall for the sales pitch. Now, ransomware. I talked around this statistic that in 2022, the number of attacks actually dropped. Unfortunately, in the beginning of 23, the numbers climbed again. I think there was a 3 times increase in ransomware attacks in the United States. Most of that was driven out of Russian ransomware groups targeting based upon the Russian attacks in Ukraine. We've seen the rise in the double extortion. They're asking for more money. So when you get hit, they're going to ask for more. And there is a reputational damage that's associated with ransomware. Because the laws are starting to get tighter on how you are required to actually report ransomware attacks, it's harder to it's harder to suffer a ransomware attack and hide it. Whether it's a public, if you're a publicly traded company, you're required by things like Sarbanes-Oxley to report those breaches. But we're also seeing contractual language being pushed down supply chains so that if you feed into somebody else's ecosystem, you have to report it to them that a breach or a ransomware attack has occurred. Ransomware is a tool in the criminal's toolbox. They will use that. They will use denial of service attacks. They will use a lot of their old stuff. But if they get into that environment and they're not sure what to do with your environment, it's most likely they'll throw ransomware on there and make you pay to get that data back. What this means, though, and I throw this stat out, 90%, and I think that number is probably about right, 90% of companies hit by ransomware or a data breach have between 5 and 20 security tools in place when they get hit. Now, one of my suppliers says that number's low. They think they have more technology. But the point is this: when a company gets hit by an attack and they have firewalls, intrusion detection systems, endpoint security, and they get hit successfully, the question that's asked by executives is, why am I buying all of this tech? And the point of this is that it's not necessarily about the tech that's causing these attacks to be successful. It's how the techs are deployed. It's how these technologies are put into the environment. And when you do an incident response, in the post-incident response, it's usually determined that these products were not set up correctly. So one of the things I've been quoted saying is that security, the skill set around security is different than the skill set around IT. I'm going to repeat that. The skill set around security is different than the skill set around IT. But what a lot of companies will do when they need a new security product is they will have the IT manager select a product, and then they will have the IT team actually deploy the product. Well, if the IT team doesn't know the product, how are they going to learn? They're going to learn the same way you would. They're going to go to a training class, or they're going to go to YouTube and they're going to learn how to install the software. But what ends up happening in a lot of these cases is the software or the hardware is not installed correctly. So it's critically important to make sure that when you are deploying a security product, that you are seeking help from somebody who is familiar with the product. We saw this with firewalls when firewalls were first becoming, ubiquitous back in the early 2000s. People were putting firewalls out and had no idea how to really set them up. And they ended up having to either hire a firewall engineer or hiring somebody to come in and help them, build that firewall correctly. That's where we are with most of the rest of the cybersecurity tools now. Please don't do it on your own. Work with companies like AVAIL, work with other companies to make sure that the product is being deployed correctly. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. At the same point, incident response is not an IT function. So if you suffer a breach, whether you suffer a ransomware attack, whether you suffer a business email compromise, if you give it to the IT team, they're not going to tell you no. They're never going to deny you. But will they really be able to fix the problem? Studies show and surveys show the answer is no. Most of the time when a company turns over an incident to the IT team, that company will be re-breached within a year. That's not because the IT team doesn't know what they're doing. It's because the IT team doesn't understand the way breaches occur. So I would strongly encourage, if any of you have been hit by a breach, or when you're hit by a breach, and it's going to happen, if I was to roll the dice today, a quarter of every company in the United States is hit in any given year. So it's a 25% chance in any given year that a company is hit by ransomware or an account takeover attack. And when that attack occurs, how are you going to handle it? And I would say talk to your insurance company if you have cybersecurity insurance, but make sure that you have a company on retainer to actually help you should something bad occur. Very, very important. Incident response and IT are separate functions. You want to make sure you have an incident response company working with you. So our first line of defense, training, scanning, firewalls. But what happens when that fails? What happens when somebody breaches our firewall? What happens when our scanning doesn't pick it up? How are you going to actually purge? How are you going to actually protect? And then how are you going to restore? So disaster recovery as a service is a fast growing area. What I've also found, especially in the small and medium sector, is that 58% of people are buying security products straight from the vendor. So one of my quotes is, friends don't let friends buy cybersecurity products from Google, but we do it. And I've done it. I'm not even gonna, I'm not going to, hide behind, anything and say, I've done the same thing. When you need a new product, you go out and you Google what's the best product. Endpoint security. You go out and Google endpoint security, and guess what shows up at the top of that Google search? CrowdStrike, maybe SentinelOne, and maybe something like Carbon Black. The reason they're there is they pay to get the top advertising space. If you go out and Google something like 24/7 SOC as a service or MDR services, Arctic Wolf will often appear as the top of that stack. Not a bad product necessarily, but is it the right product for you? So by Googling and then trusting that Google search actually is giving you the proper or the best product, we're finding ourselves buying a product without options. Don't buy products without actually considering other options. Example of CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike's a great product. I have a lot of friends that work there, but it could be expensive. If you're looking at something more economical, you might want to look at something like SentinelOne or another EDR type product. If you're looking at SOC as a service, you want 24/7 MDR services, Arctic Wolf may be the right for you. But there are other MDR services out there depending upon what your needs are. Talk to somebody, talk to an advisor, talk to AVAIL, before you make that purchase. Let's bring some other vendors to the table before you make a purchase that you will then regret. At the same time, we're living in a world of increasing compliance complexity. California Consumer Privacy Act has gone full this year. But we also have 4 other privacy laws in effect. We have Connecticut just passed a privacy law that goes live this year. We have Virginia, we have Colorado, and Utah. And the New York DFS Act, the SHIELD Act, even though it's not technically a cybersecurity privacy law, it is a very restrictive law. And a lot of the people in the tri-state area have some concerns about how they're going to actually be compliant with it. On top of that, we have things like CMMC. This is the Department of Defense's cyber maturation model. And any company that feeds into the defense matrix is going to be required to actually be CMMC compliant at one of the 3 levels. I was talking to a vendor out in Kansas City a few months back, and they said, all I do is make plexiglass domes, but I'm being required to be CMMC compliant. And I was like, well, who do you sell those domes to? They started listing off, Lockheed and Boeing. And I was like, you're part of the defense contract. Even though you don't feel like your product has any sort of technological need, you are feeding into the defense ecosystem. Therefore, CMMC will apply. So I think you're going to see a rise in companies requiring CMMC. Well, how are you going to do that? What are those requirements? How are you going to actually pass some of those attestations? On top of that, cybersecurity insurance has completely changed over the last couple of years. There's 2 things insurance companies don't want to do, and my insurance cohorts will kind of laugh at me, but I'm not wrong. They don't want to pay, and they sure don't want to lose money. They've lost money over the past few years. Cybersecurity insurance originally was thought to be a great moneymaker. They're now losing money on cybersecurity insurance. So what does that mean from an insurance provider? It means they're going to increase rates, they're going to increase what they require you to do, and they're going to decrease coverage. And that's what we're seeing. Companies that go back and talk to their cyber insurance provider are finding out that the insurance companies are requiring more technology. They're actually collecting enough information now to recognize what works to avoid ransomware attacks, what works to avoid account takeovers. And these are the focuses that they're launching. Multi-factor authentication. I talked about it earlier. It's going to become more and more of that requirement. And insurance companies, I have 4 or 5 times in the last 6 months, I've had people come to me saying that the insurance company is requiring I have multi-factor authentication. How do I do that? We can help. AVAIL can help. Endpoint detection and response. Now notice, that's not antivirus. I'm starting a little video series around endpoint detection and recovery. Antivirus, things like Avast and things like WebRoot are not enterprise level detection and response products. There is a total difference between antivirus and EDR. So if you are a company that is small, but you're rising into the mid-sized market space, you need to have EDR, and we can help deploy those. Email filtering, web monitoring, all of these things, backups. Disaster recovery as a service is one of the fastest growing areas in cybersecurity. How are you doing your backups is the question. If it's simple backup, they will target your backups. Ransomware groups will go after your backups, and they will attempt to either destroy them or encrypt them before they encrypt the rest of the data. How are you backing your data up? Is it what we call it immutable? Is that data stored in a place where it can't be touched by the criminal? In the military, we called it the 3-2-1 rule. 3 backups, 2 different mediums, 1 kept in an offsite or in an immutable location where it could not be changed. So backups are critical, and we're seeing more emphasis there. Protecting your network, segmentation, end of life, vulnerability scanning, all of these things, patching. How long does it take you to know you have to patch something, and then how long does it take to actually patch? Do you remember Log4j? A couple of years ago, Log4j came out. It was a vulnerability in a number of servers, and there were a number of large-scale breaches back in 2021. Do you know that there are still a large number of servers out there that have not patched Log4j? If that's you and you suffer a breach, insurance may not pay for that breach if you have cybersecurity insurance. Insurance companies are looking for a reason not to pay. So we've got to start understanding, how do we make ourselves more secure, and how do we make ourselves less of a target to the criminals that are out there? And then we go into things like training and vendor risk management, testing your incident response plans. Now, let's talk into a little bit of the future and where we're going. I think these are the 5 fastest growing cybersecurity technology fields out there. Number 1, MDR, SOC as a service. Who monitors your network after hours? 24/7. Most ransomware attacks occur on a weekend or a holiday. So if there is nobody monitoring your network, what would you know if somebody was actually doing damage inside your network after hours? It's very important. Also, what is your response time? The response time for most of the MDR companies is less than 15 minutes. If you have a response time of 24 hours, that may not be short enough. MFA, multi-factor authentication, different technologies around that. SASE, SD-WAN, software-defined WAN. Now, I kind of laughed about this when software-defined WAN first came out, because I was like, why would I get rid of all of my cool Cisco equipment? Then, after I had installed many Cisco networks, I realized that every 3 or 4 years, I had to buy a new network because the equipment went out of maintenance, and they had to, that was the way they made their money. Software-defined WAN takes care of some of that. And I think it's coming into its own around security, around this idea of SASE, secure access, secure edge. Cloud data security. Cloud is a big area. How do we secure the data in that location? And then lastly, compliance as a service. Compliance is a growing monster. I talked about that earlier. But these are technologies, these are services that we are starting to see more and more requests for. So let me ask you a question. If money wasn't an issue, let's take money off the table, what would you add? What would you add if you weren't worried about the number of people you had? If you're a company that has 1, 2, 3, 4 IT people, it's hard to deploy new technologies. But if you are looking at one of these things, anything on this list, we can help you with that. AVAIL and I can actually bring people to you that can provide all of these products and do it in a very economical way. Managed services outside of the environment are actually becoming cheaper than they were in the past. And there's more people open to actually having that conversation. So make the wish list, even if it's simply to say, what would the budget be? If you're looking at something like, let's look at this list, Cloud Access Security Broker, CASB. If you're looking at it and you've always thought it was very expensive, why not get a demo of it? Why not at least look at it and find out what it would cost so that you could begin budgeting for it? We want to help you see the value of security products and security products over time, because maturity is what it's about. At the end of the day, my question to you is going to be, how mature are you in cybersecurity? What's sad about this particular 5-level system, there are actually people that are below level 1. There are people that don't even have firewalls. There are people that don't even have endpoint security. How mature are you? Evaluate yourself. You need to evaluate yourself. And if you want to move up that stack, if you want to move from a level 1 to a level 2 or 2 to 3, how are you going to get there? What's your roadmap look like? Because we have to realize the criminal is less likely to hit a more mature security company than someone else. One of my friends is a local police officer, and I asked him the question. I said, "Hey, how do you prevent somebody breaking into your house?" He said, "You put an ADT sign out front, you have big bright lights that come on, and a barking dog inside the house." He goes, "Those 3 things, people won't come to your house, they'll go to the next door." So why aren't we doing that with cybersecurity? Why are we not making it harder on the criminal when they start to come into our environment? I want them to go, "Man, this one's going to be tough. Let's move on to somebody who's easier." Cybersecurity is about maturity, and it's about moving up the stack and being more proactive. This is the cybersecurity stack. There are more than 4,000 cybersecurity companies out there. And if you're a CIO or a CTO or a CISO, you are receiving every week, you're receiving somewhere between 5 and 20 unsolicited tech requests every week, right? They're asking to give you demos. They're showing you, they're telling you their product is the best thing since sliced bread. How do you evaluate that? How do you navigate that particular area? So why don't we work together, and I can help you, and AVAIL can help you navigate this cybersecurity technology, because this number is only increasing. When I started in cybersecurity, there were like 500 companies 10 years ago. There are now over 4,000. Last year, there were 3,800. That means in the last year, we've got more than 200 more cybersecurity companies. But overall, security needs to be part of everything we do. We need to make IT security at the base of what we do, not a bolt-on. This has been something I've talked about for years as well. If we can put security at the core and everything lays over the top, then we can make a much more secure environment, and we can be aware of the criminal elements that are coming into our environment. So with that, I will turn it back over to my AVAIL counterparts. I hope you have found this useful. We are here to help. We are both here to help you become more secure and to avoid these devastating attacks. Because should you find yourself victimized by these companies or by these criminal groups, you're going to suffer a lot of pain, and your IT staff is not going to enjoy that trip. So again, thank you for your time. Jason, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that. Hopefully very good content for everybody, and enjoyed that. We do have a save the date. We have another session that's coming up that's going to be a live in-person event on October 11th. It's going to be at Spooky Nook Sports in Lancaster. We're going to have a great keynote. We're in the process of finalizing that today, and there'll be some announcements, breakout sessions, very educational focused event. We'll have a number of different market leading providers, the keynote speaker, educational breakout sessions, networking, a lot of different activities, and a good array of different things that everybody can partake in and continue to enhance their cybersecurity stance and focus. This one's going to have cybersecurity and some AI mixed in with it, so it should be a great event. So with that, any questions anybody would like to ask? I think we can probably unmute or do a raise the hand. Sarah, I don't know if there's an easy way to do the Q&A.
Yep, we can either do a raise of hands. There's a Q&A chat. If people want to put some stuff in the Q&A chat, if they don't want to talk live, that's fine. So whatever, we can give it a couple minutes. If anybody has any questions or wants to chime in, please feel free.
And if you have a question you'd like to ask one-on-one, feel free to reach out to Sarah, and we can get you set up with a technology advisor or one of our solutions architects, and we can address your question in person as well.
Yep, and it looks like we do have a question here. It says, have you seen an increase in MFA token theft?
We have actually, and that's that's what I'm saying. MFA is not quite the the end all be all for cybersecurity. It is a part of a tech stack. So that's why one of the things we found is that if we don't protect the way MFA is installed, it can actually find itself being victimized, whether it's through a cookie or a token being stolen, or like I said, phishing the person through a text message. So it's really important to make sure that we're not just throwing software and making sure that the software is installed. It's about that whole feature of how that software is protected and knowing, for example, where those tokens are being stored. Do you know where those tokens are being stored? If you don't, you're not going to protect them. That's why it's important to make sure we're bringing in people that know more than just how to install software.
And to add to that, James, we have seen a very large rise. There was a kit that was released into the criminal space on how to create a phishing attack that took credentials, including the MFA token. Very professional looking sites that were put up very quickly using these kits. And they used the customers' logos. They spent a lot of time doing a little bit of the social engineering to understand who to target. And then once they got into they compromised an account, they would launch from there, sending emails from known accounts to partners or internal employees to start the cycle all over again. So it gets back to the concept of you can't just trust. If an email comes from somebody you trust that email and you click on anything you want. That gets back to the training of the people and making sure users are more skeptical and that they understand why they're clicking on a link and why they're going to a site. And make sure they're especially cautious whenever they're putting in Microsoft credentials, because they seem to be the most attacked or targeted credentials that we see right now.
Thanks, Jason. It looks like Jeff also said I have had clients running sent one fall victim and our tokens on mobile devices vulnerable. Then we have a question from Justin after that as well.
Yeah, mobile devices are increasingly becoming a target. I've run into a lot of people who say, like there was a myth for a while that Apple devices didn't have, viruses or couldn't be victimized, and completely not true. As our phones, like, my new phone has 256, meg or whatever, on it, gig. And it's because of that, there's more opportunity for me to put malicious software on them. So phones are going to be targeted. Any device that connects into your network can be targeted. And I didn't even talk about remote work, where we're starting to see home users being targeted for criminal activity because it's usually only protected through something like a VPN. So it is a holistic approach around cybersecurity. Who has access to your environment, and how are you protecting yourself against all accesses?
Thanks, James. We have a question from Justin, and it says, do you have any recommendations for DLP given the move to the cloud? Is CASB the route to solving the DLP problem?
I'm a strong proponent of SASE and including the DLP element. I think because data exists in three places. at rest, which we've done through encryption, in memory, which we do typically through some of the hardware, but where we've had the biggest issue has been with movement, data while it moves. And so I'm a believer that SASE and the DLP there is probably going to be the most efficient way to protect. The problem with DLP though is it has to keep tuning it. You can't. It's not a fire and forget thing where you create a DLP, searches and you're done. You really have to be able to keep going back and looking to see what other data is moving and should that data be moving. And I think data security is, and most of the privacy laws that we're seeing are focused around data security.
James, for that feedback. Does anybody else have any questions? Would you like to chime in or drop anything in the chat? We can hang here for about a minute, and then if not, we will thank you for your time today and move on. Well, I will say thank you all for your time today and your participation in our webinar. Please look forward to some follow-ups from me if you're looking for a recording of the presentation or some slides. Happy to connect with anybody post this call. So thanks again for everybody's time. James, thanks for coming to present with us today. And Jason, thank you as well.
Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.